Misery May is less than a fortnight away. That's 2 weeks for those of you who don't speak fortnight. And my co-host Gemma and myself asked a bunch of our favourite booktubers to recommend a miserable book they love. And some of these books are favourite reads of mine. Some of these books I really, really want to get to. So let's get rid of me and start to watch the stars of this show, my favourite booktubers.
My Misery May pick causes misery on a couple of different levels. Actually, it's a book that Scott and I agree on, which ever so rarely happens, so it's got to be a pretty special book, right? The book is The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. This book is set in contemporary Ireland. We're following a family of 4. The father Dickie, mother Imelda, their college-aged daughter Cass, and their son PJ. This family once had access to wealth. They were quite lucrative in their finances, and the point in which the reader meets this family is when finances are starting to be a problem. They're being crushed under the weight of not having money anymore, and as this pressure grows, you see the icky muckiness of this family's background, the things that they've gone through, and just the dark side of humanity through this process of watching this family crumble under pressure. I think this book is brilliant because with this family of 4, we get 4 different voices. They all sound completely different, and that can be kind of challenging for a reader because some of the perspectives takes a little longer to actually get into the rhythm of the reading. But if you're not liking the story, which is already miserable in and of itself, the length of the book can also make you quite miserable because it's something like 650 pages. So if you're in it and you're not liking it, you can also be miserable just reading it because it is such a long book. I love this book. I loved every miserable, icky, muckiness in it and thought it was fantastic. Scott did as well. But also just, you can be miserable on a couple of different levels, being that it is so long.
Hi everyone, it's Charlotte from Queenie Reads, and my favourite miserable book is, predictably, if you know me, Les Misérables by Victor Hugo. See, it even has the word miserable in it, so I feel like I should get bonus points for that. Like many people, I first discovered this book through my love of the musical, and I would highly encourage reading the book as well. It is a 1300-page book, so I can't give you an in-depth synopsis on everything that happens. But contrary to popular belief, Les Misérables is actually not about the French Revolution. It's actually set in early 19th century France, and we are mostly following the story of the recently released convict Jean Valjean after he spent 19 years in prison for stealing a loaf of bread to save his sister's starving child. Despite being released as a former convict, he finds himself a social outcast, a pariah, and he cannot hold down a job, and has understandably become embittered and jaded about the world. This is until he meets a bishop who takes him in and is the first person to show him kindness for many years, even going as far as to cover for him to the authorities when they try to rearrest Valjean for stealing the bishop's silver. This act of kindness puts Valjean down a path for the rest of the book, where he is trying to turn his life around and become an honest man, even though he knows that in order to do this, he has to completely change his identity, and that means breaking his parole. And for the rest of the book, we see the next 20 or so years unfold, in which he successfully changes his identity and ends up establishing a thriving business within a small village, becoming a very rich man. We see him having to adopt a young girl whose mother very tragically dies following dismissal from his factory, in one of the most brutal depictions of a fallen woman that I have ever seen in literature. Eventually, his identity becoming exposed and him having to run away from the law. Later, we see him coming in contact with the failed student rebellion of June 1832. All the while through the course of this book, he is trying to escape the clutches of the Inspector Javert, this police inspector who is absolutely obsessed with tracking him down and rearresting him. And we see through this book how Valjean is constantly challenged between choosing what is right and wrong, between doing what is godly and what is self-serving. And he feels like he can never truly escape his past self. Les Misérables is in many ways a bleak and miserable book. It is a book about suffering, and many of the characters in this book die in some of the most horrific ways. It's a book that is about injustice, intolerance, about young people coming together to rebel against the system and make a better world, and ultimately failing. It is a book about the evils of gossip, and it is a book that reveals some of the deepest cruelties that humans can inflict on each other. And it's a book where our main character is just plagued by self-loathing the whole way through. Valjean can never truly see himself as a good person because he has been taught by society that because of one act that he did when he was much younger, he is forever a bad person. And it is truly heartbreaking to read. But it's also a story about redemption, about love, about kindness. And so despite all of the bleakness, despite how miserable it is in title and in tone, I still really highly recommend it, even if it does include a 50-page digression about the Battle of Waterloo, to which only 2 of the final pages are actually relevant to the plot. That's all part of the charm.
Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my contribution to Scott from Gunpowder Fiction and Plots, a video about Misery May. Every year, Scott and Gemma, those sick, twisted individuals, put together a video which they encourage us to read miserable books that are going to break our hearts and make us feel bad about ourselves. And Scott asked me to contribute a title, and I picked the most miserable book I've ever read, which is The Family of Pascual Duarte by Camilo Jose Cela. Cela is a Spanish writer who won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and this book is easily the most miserable book I've ever read. It is narrated to us by Pascual, who is in prison awaiting the carrying out of a sentence because he's been convicted of a serious crime. And essentially, he details all the horrible things that happen in his life and happen in the life of his family. And just give you a basic rundown of some of those things with as few spoilers as possible. One of his family members dies of rabies while locked in a wardrobe. Another one of his family members, several of his family members engage in prostitution. There are murders, there are abuse of children, there are sexual assaults, and one of the characters has his ears chewed off by pigs. If that doesn't scream Misery May, I don't know what does. There's my contribution to this video about recommended books for Misery May. Oh, it's also an excellent book.
Hey Scott, I am here on order with England to invite you and your viewers to visit Wales on your Mystery May travels. And in true Welsh fashion, it is pissing down with rain and blowing a gale, so I'm going to be quick. Much like you and Gem, I love me some misery, but I like my misery with a little bit of light and shade. I like the joy, I like the hope, just so that you feel the real impact of the devastation when it hits. And the book that I want to recommend to you has that. It's AIDS. Anthony Chaplin's A Room Above a Shop is about 2 men in South Wales in the 80s living in Britain under Thatcherite rule and Section 28. It's written in vignettes, but don't let that put you off because I'm not usually a fan of vignette books, but the narrative remains quite linear, so you stay super connected to the story. The writing style is unique and compelling and delivers the maximum amount of emotional impact in the fewest amount of words. You don't need to be reading massive great tomes to be super invested in characters and their stories, and this book demonstrates that really beautifully and is a fantastic example of Welsh literature. I hope it cuts your heart out with a spoon as it did me, and if you're not yet convinced, here is actual footage of me sobbing whilst reading it. I wish you the most miserable of Mays.
Hi, my name is Hannah. My channel is called Savage Reads, and when Scott asked me to come up with a recommendation for Misery May, I thought, well, a lot of my books might fit under that heading. But I decided that I needed to stick with the theme, which is around the globe, and I was born in the United States and I live in Spain, so I was looking for a book that was set outside of those countries, as well as the author being from outside of those 2 countries. And so I came up with the book, The Unwomanly Face of War, an oral history of women in World War II by Svetlana Alexievich. And this book I read about 3 years ago, but it has really stuck with me. The author does a wonderful job of talking to so many different women and weaving together their stories into a narrative of women's experience during wartime. Now, this is specifically about Soviet women in World War II, which is a perspective that I don't feel like I've read in any other book about World War II. And so I really appreciated that. And she manages to really show these different perspectives, make it compelling, and some of these stories are just so heartbreaking, so awful to read, but also so important to understand the unique experiences that women have during wartime and the unique problems that they have, and also to understand the true human cost of war. And I think this book was just expertly done, and I highly recommend it.
Hi everyone, my name is Heidi, and my channel is My Reading Life. Thanks to Scott for inviting me to participate in a recommendations video for Misery Around the Globe in May. This makes me laugh every year when Scott hosts this reading theme. But I do have a book to recommend for you for Misery Around the Globe, and that is this memoir from Rwanda. This is Cockroaches by Scholastic Mukasonga. This is translated from the French by Jordan Stump. It was originally published in 2006 and then translated and published in English language edition later in 2016 and 2019, I believe. And this is a fabulous memoir. It is quite a lot of misery that happens in this book because Scholastic Mukasonga is talking about growing up Tutsi in a Hutu-dominated Rwanda. She is talking about growing up in the years before the 1994 genocide in Rwanda, but she writes about it in such straightforward but beautiful language. It really draws you in. She talks about the quiet, simple moments in her childhood and with her family and the beauty of those moments, and then the terror of being separated from her family and not being in Rwanda when the murdering starts and what that's like. She had lost a lot of family members in the genocide, and she doesn't shy away from talking about that, but it's not gratuitous at all. It's beautiful, and it is really heartfelt. It's emotional, and it's a wonderful introduction to this really important piece of history that took place in Rwanda. I hope you will pick it up and give it a try.
Hi, Scott. Thank you so much for including me. I am going to recommend the book Small Country by Gaël Faye. Small Country is a semi-autobiographical novel that's set in Burundi in the early 1990s, and it's told through the eyes of Gabby, our 10-year-old protagonist. She's French and Rwandan. The novel starts out at the beginning of his life before the war, and he is having fun, hanging out with his friends, playing and running around, experiencing life, and then he gradually loses his innocence as the war begins, and he eventually experiences the Rwandan genocide. And so as this violence and political unrest spreads, Gabby's world gets really torn apart. He has the experience of knowing people on both sides of the conflict, and even within his own family there is a lot of disruption and conflict and violence. It really captures very poignantly the loss of innocence and the complexities of identity and belonging for this boy, and of course the devastating impact of conflict on ordinary lives. It also taught me a lot about the Rwandan genocide that I didn't know about. It really feels like a first-hand account of that war and that genocide. And those are two events that aren't widely covered or there are not very many books about it. So it's for that reason in particular that I was wanting to make this recommendation. Also, Gaël Faye himself is a rapper and a poet, so the writing is very lyrical, very beautiful. The young boy Gabby also falls in love with one of his schoolmates, so there is a lot to be miserable about, but there are also things about this book that are very beautiful, very complex, and hopeful.
Hi there, I'm Lindy. My channel is Lindy's Magpie Reads. And my recommendation for Misery May is a graphic novel called Dog Days. It's by the Korean author Kim Suk Gendry Kim, and it was translated by Janet Hong. So this is autofiction, and the narrator tells us about how her husband was so sad after his grandmother died that they decided to get a dog to cheer him up. So when he was growing up, his grandmother had a dog, and he said it was like a brother to him. The narrator has never been interested in dogs, but she becomes so attached to this new puppy. It's a corgi. They call him Carrot. And Carrot has a lot of anxiety. So the couple ends up moving from the city to the country so that their dog will feel better. Her husband has a job in the city. He teaches, so he commutes. He's not home all the time, and the narrator works at home. So she starts experiencing loneliness. It's very different to be out in the country, and those two things are enough for misery, right? Grief, loneliness. Well, let's pile on some more. How about some animal abuse? Yes. The couple discover, to their horror, that the people in this village, there's a lot of old people there, and they raise dogs to eat. This is something that their friends in the city can't even imagine that it still is going on in Korea. There was a survey that showed that something like 93% of Koreans would not eat a dog. So the tensions between the narrator and her husband and these other villagers, and what they see happening to dogs who are left tied up outside or kept in small cages and being butchered there, is expressed in Gendry Kim's art in wonderful ways. Sometimes shocking, but you can see her efforts to change people's minds, and the fact that dogs loom large in this story. You can see in the imagery, Gendry Kim's depiction of dogs is so specific. You know, you can feel the personality of these dogs that she's drawing. The couple ends up with more than the one dog that they started out with. And the final author's note, I think, is so important because she writes that 5 years after they moved to the countryside, the government of Korea, so this is January 2024, outlawed the dog meat industry. Such a great victory for animal rights activists, both within Korea and outside, who had been hoping for this outcome. I hope that you enjoy Dog Days as much as I did.
Indian Horse by Richard Wagamese, and he is an Indigenous author from Canada. Now, this is a fiction read, and it is following Saul Indian Horse, and so he is at a very difficult place in his life. He is in a treatment center for his alcoholism. He knows he needs to change, and in order to do that, he starts sharing his story and his history of living in a residential school, and some of the abuses, trials, and racism that he endured. So this book can feel pretty bleak at some times, but it does balance it out with some levity, a lot of hockey, and some beautiful and hopeful writing from the author. The author does a really great job at making you feel like not only did you understand a new perspective and understand some of these difficult topics, but that you as a human have grown and learned. And I thought some of the wisdom and ideas that came from this book were really profound, and I highly recommend it. It is a miserable and difficult read, but I think you come out of it a better person.
Please check out the channel of any creator you are not familiar with, and then please head on over to Gemma's channel and see which booktubers she asked and what their recommendations were. I guarantee you, Gemma's booktubers are almost as good as the booktubers I asked. Thank you for watching. Bye bye.